Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Question and Answer for Neoliberalism. And boy, there were some technical questions on this one. So, Jeremy and I have been polishing up and doing our research, and I think we're ready. What do you think, Jeremy?
I think we can do it.
All right. So, fire at me. I'm ready, I think.
Okay. At Christopher Ellis asks, as for the very strange notions about the efficiency of private enterprise and so forth, where in history is this observed? Certainly not in the last 80 years.
So this is, I think, is best understood as a comparative example. And why I don't want to be like a big defender of the free market. It's pretty clear that the free market really does work pretty well for a lot of things, just not for everything. It's the universalization as ever that creates the problem. So if you look at demand side economies, like the Soviet Union, one of the problems they developed is all kinds of distribution inefficiencies, production inefficiencies, because they weren't working to market forces, they were working towards other goals. So, for instance, if you had to distribute a certain amount of steel, then you're forced to distribute that amount of steel. Well, then the tractor manufacturers will just make really heavy tractors, right? Because hey, we've got to use this amount of steel because that's what's available. So make heavy tractors. And so, but where market forces are in theory and often in practice, you can see very much more efficient and better distribution networks. So if you look at food distribution today, I mean, it's still hugely wasteful. Lots of food rots, but the distribution systems are vastly more efficient. Amazon, of course, is the most ridiculous example, where it discovered that it did the research and said, if we can deliver the faster we deliver it, the more likely someone is to order it. And so they've created this madly efficient distribution network that is associated with Amazon to get the goods and services to you quickly and theoretically cheaply. But again, it's really a comparative problem. Is like when you looked at demand side economies, controlled economies, top-down economies, those are also wildly, often bizarrely inefficient because they have all sorts of, what are they trying to achieve? They're trying to employ their friends or use the factories of the people who pay them money, or all these other non-economic factors come in very powerfully. And so they're very, very poor indeed in many ways. And so it's not a race between really great systems that have everything solved. It's sort of wow, that doesn't work at all, and this works somewhat for some things, so hey, let's try this out kind of comparison. So in this case, I would have to say, if you look at the history of economics over the last 70 years, there are many instances and examples where you can see free market distribution working ever so much better than command economies. However, that doesn't make them universal solutions, unfortunately, but it'd be great if it did, because it's nice to have universal solutions. But the counterexamples, of course, are things like medicine in the United States, where it's a complete and utter catastrophe. And so no one gets good medical care at incredible cost is sort of the way the American has decided to do it. So trying to figure all that out is complex, and no simple question like, oh, free market will solve this is going to make everything perfect, of course.
Mm-hmm. And why do you think people have that feeling, like, the kind of sarcasm that was in that last question about, when has the free market been efficient? Why is that?
Well, because I think we're just so used to it. If you live in the neoliberal modern economy, you see and interact with often shockingly efficient and price very helpful distribution systems. For instance, one of the things that we have inflation now is because tariffs are going up on China, and the Chinese economy grew in a particular way, and so production in China got more expensive. But for about 15 years, China was booming, in part because super efficient global distribution networks were delivering increasingly cheap goods, which kept inflation down for everybody. And we loved that globally. People loved that. And so China just boomed as a manufacturing economy. based on this distribution network, which was primarily, I mean, not imperfectly, but pretty free-ish. You could order from almost anywhere in the world. They were delivering to suppliers all over the globe, and the cost just plummeted because labor and all the externalities, like who cares about the environment, who cares where we're getting the iron from, who cares about the 14-year-old girls working in the factories, right? We're just going to put that on one side, and we're going to go, hey, look how much cheaper my shoes are than they used to be. And that network efficiency kind of increased the quality of living for a lot of people all over the world. And one of the things we're experiencing now is the deceleration from that. So we've gotten so used to it that what we see now are all of the places that the free market doesn't work. And we're really upset by that. Because we feel it more powerfully. But it's like the Catholic Church was incredibly good at criticizing the Catholic Church, right? I mean, oh my God, were they good at it, because they were in it and they saw it, right? And so it's much easier to see the inefficiencies when you have all the benefits of the efficiencies than if you were in the Soviet Union looking around and you went, wow, like we don't have color TVs and that sucks. We can't seem to make them. We can't seem to distribute them. There's always these mismatches in markets. It's just no good.
All right. At Ellis Artil says, you have the "it hurts, but it'll work later" model you were talking about. Government deregulates to enter global trade, which initially hurts domestic quality of life. But getting access to global trade eventually means the more economically efficient, in theory, imports will make up for this loss of quality of life. So is that how it's worked with kind of smaller countries moving into the neoliberal order?
Yeah, this has been, I mean, I think this is right. Like the narrative that's sold is, oh yeah, it's going to be a rough transition. We get it. But in 10 years, you're going to be the United States. You're going to be, you're right. All of a sudden your economy is going to boom. Everything's going to be glorious. And this works out in different ways. Obviously it doesn't always work out that way, perhaps rarely works out that way. But even when it does, the people who benefit from the transition are often not necessarily the people who paid for the pain. So after NAFTA, there was a massive wave of Mexican immigration from the countryside into the United States, and I mean massive. And it was driven by the fact that NAFTA lowered barriers from cheap government subsidized corn in the United States from flowing into Mexico. So all these small scale farmers who had been, growing corn, living in a local economy, are suddenly being priced out because there's no way they can compete with local production. So, hey, this is cheap corn for the Mexican market. Well, that's good for the consumer, but it's terrible for, millions of small scale farmers. So they pay the price. So if you're living in the city and all of a sudden the cost of your food drops by 20%, you're like, woo, NAFTA. If you're living in the countryside and your farm just became not viable and you're starving, you're not so excited about NAFTA. And so it's not just whether this narrative works, which is a good question, often doesn't work, but even when it does, quote unquote, work on average, right? It's always that question of who gets the pain and who gets the benefits. And that distribution is often certainly open to ethical reflection. Let's put it that way. You don't look at it and go, hey, wait a second, who's winning here and who's losing? The classic example is in the American Rust Belt. As these trade barriers came down and investment strategies changed in the United States and abroad, who was paying for a lot of this was the classic, high cost, quote unquote, high cost relative to China or other low cost country, union labor. Okay, well, there's any number of things you could do to address that. You could just say, hey, if you have a union job as on, January 1, 1977, and you lose that job in the next 5 years, your health care and pension are guaranteed. You don't lose that. Right. We're sorry you can't keep your job. This is the cost of transition to a modern world. Yeah, your wages may drop, but you won't lose your health care and pension, right? That's going to be protected. We know this is coming, right? Like, yay. So you go, oh, okay, well, that's not perfect, but hey, at least the people who are going to pay a lot of this price have a lot of the protection.
Hmm.
Rarely, oh my gosh, so rarely are these sorts of um, incentives or reparations or counterbalances put into place. And it tends to be like, okay, you're going to suffer the pain, Mexican farmer, but we're not going to put, we're not going to use a bunch of those taxes to say, hey, we're going to subsidize the Mexican corn production, and to say for every hectare of corn that you have in production in Mexico, we're going to give you $500 worth of subsidy so that you don't just go bankrupt tomorrow.
Hmm.
And it'll be on a 10-year sliding scale so that you have 10 years to make the transition to some other crop.
Hmm. And what does it look like on the ground for some of these smaller countries, like, I don't know, like Greece or, European countries that they relied on a certain kind of
Oh,
local economy? And then are people just going out and trying to plug themselves into whatever the new
yeah.
industry is? Or
Well, and within the EU, when countries joined, lots of migration. The EU did put a lot of transfer payments in place, but the austerity measures following the 2008 financial collapse countries that had just absorbed like big transitions, like, okay, we're not going to have free housing. Oh, we're not going to have free medical care. Oh, we're going to have to cut the subsidies for gas. Oh, all of these things went away. And you're like, wow, this is a new world. And then the central banks wouldn't bail them out when they got into trouble. And then they had to apply austerity. And then, so people had to move either within Europe. This is one of the things that drove Brexit, is this wave of people moving out of particularly new Eastern European countries into England, because hey, well, we just got wiped out. England looks pretty groovy. Let's go over there. We have free movement. We have free. Let's go. And so you had lots of migration. Notice migration, a huge issue in Europe. And lots of just social dislocation, which has led, I think unsurprisingly, to the rise of populism.
I see. At Anthonini says, interesting that people who I know that are against neoliberalism are also against Trump and Brexit, even though they are two of the biggest recent counters to neoliberalism.
Yeah, this is again, the populist nationalist rhetoric is specifically like, hey, the neoliberal world order as conceptualized does decrease the power of nation states. This is what it's about, right? Global free trade means we all agree to let market forces and large multinational companies and large international banking and financial entities make lots of decisions about what's going to happen in our country. And we're supposed to just sit there, we being the citizens of all these countries, and go, well, that's the price you pay for participating in the global world economic order. And on average, it's going to work out best for all of us, and we're all getting richer, and blah blah. And that narrative, by the way, worked really well, despite all the evidence, and many economists are arguing all the problems. So but as a cultural phenomenon, right? Again, that this is why the 2008 financial collapse is so important, is because it just exposed all this and just said, hey, wait a second. And so all the critics and criticism that had been there anyway, boom, they hit the ground running, and they're like, look, just, we told you so, right? And so because the left, I would say, has been much slower to respond to and criticize the neoliberal order, because Tony Blair, Obama, Tony Blair was, I forget how long he was prime minister for, a long time, neoliberal. Obama, 2 terms, neoliberal. So there was this long run, Thatcher, of course, these long running administrations on both sides, but culminating in even many left-wing administrations essentially just assuming that the neoliberal order was there. And so one reason, again, population and the right, people, Hungary and Brexit and Trump, their nationalist rhetoric resonates so strongly, because not that people are going, oh, I criticize neoliberalism and I don't like the abrogation of my personal authority within the context of global economy. People don't think that. What they think is like, hey, I don't like the way stuff is happening, and this makes sense, like, to me, that now that we don't control a lot of our trade, we don't control a lot of these rules. My nation has supposedly given up this authority. Why'd they do that? I don't want to do that. I want to take control again. That's not madness.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, but it is interesting that you see this, is that people are like, oh, I hate the neoliberal order. But again, I don't like Trump. You can do that. That's perfectly reasonable. But you need to recognize that a lot of Trump's policies, to the extent that he's consistent about anything, but a lot of the nationalist policies, whether from Le Pen or from Orban or from in Turkey, what's his name? Who's the head of Turkey's been Erdogan, right? Like Brexit again. All this nationalist rhetoric is it's not wrong when it says, hey, we've lost a lot of our national authority to these global markets, because that's exactly what's happened. Now,
Mhm.
the response and the answer they're providing, it's not clear that's doing. I mean, look at Erdogan in Turkey. He's struggling mightily with inflation and other problems because crazy economic policies, right? So, but they are critics of it, and they are trying to figure out new ways around it, I would say.
Yeah, and is this kind of criticism, like I'm against neoliberalism, and then obviously I'm against Trump and Brexit? Is that sort of someone who's to the left of center rank and file Democrats? Like I wasn't really cozy with Obama. I wish I'm to the left of Obama, but now of course I also don't want Brexit. Like, is that the kind of...
Yeah, I think so. I think this is I think that would be the critique. I mean, and again, if you look at the moment in 2008 where, Obama administration could have done anything it wanted. It could have nationalized the banks, which functionally it kind of did, but it could have said, all right, we're throwing a bunch of people into jail. We're taking the assets. We're going to break this all up and make 1,000 tiny banks, and, no more of this nonsense.
Mhm.
We could have intervened massively in the housing markets and just reset values so that homeowners came out ahead. But instead it said, no, what we need to do is get the financial institutions and the banks back on their feet so that the game that we were playing before can keep going.
Mhm.
And I think that's where a lot of left people were like, hey, we were kind of hoping for something a little more creative and radical. And
Right.
it just didn't happen.
I see. At Tennessee Jed says, hydrocarbon is more responsible for lifting people's living standards than neoliberal ideology, in my humble opinion. Having the equivalent of 500 billion underpaid workers from hundreds of millions of years of stored solar energy is where this expansion comes from. So is our natural resources actually the reason why people were lifted out of poverty?
No, this is a very interesting point and very important point, because it is clear that a lot of the growth that we've experienced over the last 100 years or so comes from the discovery of a new source of energy. And it's hard. History is so fascinating. Until you get steam power, basically horses and wind. There's some dams that are running, but water power, right? Like there wasn't a lot of energy around. Energy was unbelievably valuable. So it's, damming rivers to turn paddles so that you could grind wheat, famously. That was big time. There were water-driven sawmills. That was big time. But basically, yeah, it wasn't available. There was just a lot. Wood burning was incredibly inefficient and expensive. Yeah, so energy sources have always been tremendously valuable and were tremendously scarce until the hydrocarbon revolution. And while I don't want to discount that, and it's a very good observation, if you look at the GDP growth charts, poverty charts, and basically any other economic measure you like, the hydrocarbon revolution is well and truly globally rolling along by 1950. I mean, cars, trucks, planes, shipping, factories, hydro, it is coal. I mean, it's rolling. We are rolling, baby. Steam power has been around for a while, and coal. And so the coal hydrocarbon revolution is now 200 years old. Let's just say it gets really going in 17, well, it's too early. So it's 150 years old. By 1800, you're definitely getting the coal hydrocarbons going. And then by 1950, the oil-based hydrocarbons are 30 years in place. And then, so it's a going concern already, but it's really in the late 60s, early 70s that globalization really starts to take place. And it's hard to see how that is driven primarily by hydrocarbons rather than a change in global trade patterns and investment strategies to harness that energy, because it's already there, and it's already widely distributed. Because it's, even if you look at the charts again, I don't have them in front of me, but it's really like late 70s that this kicks off, even though there is the oil price shock and oil rationing in theory and all of that. Yeah, so I would say no, it's insufficient in itself, particularly when you look at the pattern of adoption. So very important, vitally important. There's no doubt about this. There's expansion of electricity grid systems driven by hydroelectric and by coal and gas, just massively important, no doubt about it. But the just titanic growth that you see starting in the late 80s or early 80s, late 70s is more hydrocarbon. Also, it would not explain something like why Russia or the Soviet Union collapses, why their economy was struggling, because they certainly had access to that power source.
Mm-hmm.
So there's got to be some other differential element in there, just as an example. But it is a valid point. Like, do not underestimate the incredible transformation that having like electricity come out of your wall and wash your clothes is. It's like, that's just miracle.
Yeah. At Uncle Ron says, I don't know. It's pretty strange to blame all the corruption and fraud that led to the crisis in 2008 on free market. So was the 2008 crash about the free market?
Was it? Yes. Okay. I'm just going to go out on a limb and say, rarely do I want to give an unqualified, but yes, it was definitely, this was definitely generated by the free market. In fact, it was generated specifically by aggressive lobbying by banks, insurance agencies, real estate interests, both in the United States and globally, to change investment bond finance laws that would allow this, to make it possible. What happened in 2008, the pattern that led into this actually was structurally illegal, but the laws were changed systematically over 30 years. But specifically over the 5 to 10 years leading up to this, the international banking people literally wrote a new set of reserve requirements and all these sorts of things that allowed a lot of this to happen. In Europe, the lending standards and banking standards would not allow European banks to participate in Europe in this way. So what they did was they went shopping abroad. This is why this was all about U.S., not all, but primarily about U.S. mortgage-backed securities, is because European financial institutions were not allowed to create them, and real estate markets were not allowed to sell property under these sorts of circumstances. Lending was not allowed to take place, so on and so forth. So it's pretty easy to track the regulatory things necessary to allow this kind of collapse to take place, and they were 100% argued for by a bunch of corporate and lobbying interests that said, hey, free the market and good stuff will happen. And because so many loans were being given, particularly to poor people, this is one of the things, politicians did not want this to stop, because they're like, look, poor people are buying homes for the first time. And it's like, well, they're sort of buying, they're kind of buying homes. They're kind of taking on tremendously insane amounts of debt for no potential ability to repay it.
Mm-hmm.
So that kind of, free market thing. And the important step to remember here is it was like, oh, free market incentives make all this work. And this is not my analysis. Lots of people have talked about this. But if you look at every step, so if I'm a borrower and you say, hey, we'll give you, $500,000, you don't have to give us any paperwork, just sign here and you can have this house. It's like, well, that seems pretty good. Now it might be financial suicide, but I'm like, you can see the incentive, right? The incentive is take the cash. And then if you're the lending agent, and I've actually talked to these lending agents, and there's lots of interviews, of course, with these people, they're like, oh, I was getting $5,000 every time I gave a loan, right? Like this was my cut. And so they're like, I was doing 10 loans a day. I didn't care what my incentive, my manager would say, push loans out the door.
Mm-hmm.
So they're like, okay, great. So I'm making whatever, $50,000 a week or a month plus my salary pushing these crazy loans out the door. So the consumer's happy. Look, they gave me all this money for God knows why. The sales agent is like super happy. The realtors are like, wow, look, this person who doesn't have a job just bought a $500,000 house and I get 6%. Jackpot. The people building the houses are like, holy crap, they're buying houses like, man, jackpot. The people selling the houses are happy. At every stage, and the banks are selling these mortgages into the market and they're being bought at premium. So they're like, this is great. We're not holding this crap. We just sell it on. People buy it. We make a fortune. And the market was up, up, up. So everybody was happy at every step, right until they weren't. Right? And so this is a classic sort of back to the criticism of neoliberalism side of this. The incentives for everybody to profit was there and everybody was profiting until, they weren't. And then everybody, then the whole system comes crashing down. And so it really is an almost perfect petri dish experiment in banks and real estate and insurance underwriting standards saying, hey, free us up and we'll make everybody rich. And then the regulators apparently said, okay, that seems reasonable. And they did. And then, they came crashing down.
Mm-hmm. Kind of trust us.
Yeah, trust us. Yeah, what's the worst that could happen? And again, I do want to remind people that because it's the example that always sticks in my head about the quote unquote free market is when I was in Washington State, a group of I think 3 doctors were busted for selling fake chemotherapy. So chemotherapy is hugely expensive, hard to get, hard to manufacture. And so they realized that, man, you can make a lot of money selling to other doctors things that really aren't chemotherapy.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that it just kills patients, like, sure. Like, okay, the patients die. The patients and their insurance companies are paying a huge amount of money to get not treated and die. But other than that small, tiny flaw in the problem, you're right. And so this notion that free market will sort things out, eventually they were caught. But, what kind of regulation do you need to make sure this kind of thing happens as rarely as possible? Because there's certainly a financial incentive to do it. And unfortunately, there does seem to be a small percentage of people who will do anything for money, including faking chemotherapy.
At Tom Rowe says, and this is a longer question, what the free market guys don't get about reality is that they think that everyone would compete in a free market and that would drive innovation. First, marketing old things is way more effective and risk-free than innovation. Second, the big players, pharma, oil, energy, food conglomerates, would much rather just build cartels and rip everyone off instead of competing for the best service and goods. Free markets just mean more unregulated cartels. So, and there's more to it, but I'm going to stop there.
Yeah. First, hello, Tom. Tom Rowe, I think his last name there.
Okay.
Yes. This is one of the problems that Adam Smith said that I paraphrase, no 2 businessmen ever met together without the function of forming a cartel. And there's a big report out now in Europe by Mario Draghi, who's a sort of technocratic center-right sort of thinker, politician, economist. And what he points out is, I mean, Adam Tooze, the economist, talks about this. What it boils down to, in one way of reading it, there's a lot of in there, but one way of reading it is that GDP growth in Europe is slower than the United States because of consumer protections and anti-monopoly laws. And so, if you get a cell phone plan in Europe, it's much less expensive than in the United States, even though it's the same plan, much less being like a third, because of consumer protection and lots of competition. In the United States, you have, where I lived before, it was a functional monopoly. There was only one actual service you could get, Verizon, hello, and it was just a ripoff in every possible way. However, that ripoff meant that they are really highly profitable and you want to invest in them.
Mm-hmm.
And so what this demonstrates is this bizarre notion is that, in some ways, it's better for your country's GDP to kind of rip your people off.
Mm-hmm.
But it's better for your people, but maybe worse for your GDP to not do that. And so, yeah, the incentives towards monopoly is just immense. Why compete when you can just form a monopoly, a cartel, and get rid of this? By the way, if we've all lived through this, if you're older, say if you're in 50 plus, or even a little younger than that, because there used to be a lot of record companies. And this meant there were a lot of different artists, and there was a lot of different promotion, and there was a lot of experimentation, and there was a lot of crazy stuff getting recorded and distributed and heard. Now there's almost no record companies. And what this meant is every time a record company would buy another record company, is which they would do, is they would say, okay, we had 20 country people, you had 20 country people. We don't need 40 country musicians. We don't want to promote that many. It's grossly inefficient, too much marketing, too much market saturation, too much duplication. So we're just going to cut the contracts of half these musicians. So for the record company, this makes perfect sense. For people who like country music and who like music generally, this is horrible.
Yeah.
Right. And so United States used to have like 50 record companies, and now I think there's like 3 or 4. Right, they're down to this handful, and they did this across used to be labels that specialized in jazz, and then you just buy them, shut them down, take 1 or 2 artists. This is the process. And so yes, innovation is always is no good. We don't like innovation because it is probably going to cut into somebody's business margin, and that person, if they're big enough, they're going to fight back. They're going to fight back very, very powerfully. Another one you can look at is independent bookstores in the United States, where Amazon just came in and wiped them out. But one reason they wiped them out is because Amazon was selling books cheaper online than the bookstores could buy them wholesale. And so they had no chance to compete with price. They were never going to be competitive. They were just driven out of business. And once they're all driven out of business, of course, Amazon raises their fees. It's exactly what Amazon's been doing. It's not complicated or difficult to figure out. You just monopolize and jack up your fees. This is Netflix. Why is Netflix suddenly jacking up everybody's fees, running commercials and doing all this? Well, they can.
And what about the replacements that pop up for, say, the music industry, like YouTube, for example, artists kind of having a more direct relationship with the listener, or on like buying used books on eBay, which is sort of similar to getting your books at the used bookstore, and that it's cheap and you can kind of
and this is the continual struggle. But I think Tom's point is that the free market doesn't drive innovation and doesn't drive this. The free market, left to its own devices without anti-monopolistic laws and all protections for consumers and all this, it actively wants to work against it. Right? They're trying to stop people from doing this. Another example from the United States is, I think it was before the big micro brewing boom, it was something like 92% of the beer was consumed came from 3 companies. Right. And there's no evidence that people want to buy beer from only 3 companies. It's just they had completely conquered the market. But slowly some laws got changed, and the microbrew industry kind of figured out how to maneuver. And this has been an ongoing, if you're just interested, read about the microbrewery struggle against the major breweries industry in the United States. And oh my gosh, like you will discover that this was not a, oh, look, some small competition. That's fine. We don't care. We're, a multi-billion-dollar company. If some people want to make small beers, we don't care. That's fine. No, this has been a knockdown, drag out, lobbyists, distribution denying, laws change, like middle of the night deals struck all over the country for years to try and kill the microbrew industry. And yeah, so Tom's point is well taken. Yeah, it's a problem.
Okay. At Joseph M says, it's not any country's responsibility to make sure that world poverty declines at the expense of that country's own economic growth and development. If that's the goal, then NATO should require that each country contribute an equal rate of their annual GDP for this specific reason. It's criminal to put this bill on the American people.
Yeah, this is again, this is why I'm always interested in philosophy, because people say, oh, economics is a technical field, but the second you stop and think about it, you get a point like this that was raised. I'm sorry, what was the name again? I'm sorry. It's excellent point.
At Joseph M.
Okay, at Joseph M. So an excellent point being raised by at Joseph M. Because what you realize is this is not an economic question. This is an ethical question. To what extent should any country, if at all, sacrifice some of its own growth potential or own wealth for the sake of increasing the opportunity and reducing the poverty of some other country or some other group of countries?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is, it's a fair question. And to say, hey, if the United States could shave 1% off our GDP, we're doing all right. And we could lift, 500 million people out of poverty. Doesn't that seem like a good trade? Could we make that argument? Would be willing to make that argument? Yeah, but it's a struggle. And this is why the nation state is such an interesting concept, because what it says is my interests as an individual are aligned with the interests of my nation state. So when my nation state does well, then I do well. This is preposterous, by the way. This is like saying when the Pope is rich, I'm rich. Like this is just medieval, nonsense. But this is the argument. It's a great argument. It's very great in the sense of, wow, is it effective? Not great in the sense of it's rational, but it is powerful and resonates with people. We really do buy into this for some reason. And so then when somebody says, hey, would it be worthwhile to, again, sacrifice a little of your own GDP or, have some unemployment in your country so that China could do better? No, like people go, no, that's ridiculous. Screw the Chinese. I want the United States to prosper, or I want Italy to prosper, or I want China to prosper. Chinese are not going, hey, what can we do for the US? The Chinese are going, screw the US. What can we do for China? And then the question is, well, is this a prisoner's dilemma game where if we all cooperate, everybody does better? Or is this some other kind of game, which I think it would be. Prisoner's dilemma is far too simplified in this situation. But, what kind of game are we playing globally that we could best sort out a win? But if you asked people in Pittsburgh to vote whether they should shut down your steel plant so that a lot of people in China could do better, they're going to vote no every single time. And that's not crazy. That's like, let's vote no to that. So this is a fair point, which is rarely raised. And this is one of if you want to come at a critique of neoliberalism in another direction, is to say functionally what you're doing is asking for these kinds of trade-offs. And the neoliberal argument, to defend it for a second, is to say, oh, but in aggregate, always in aggregate, everybody will do better if we pursue these goals. And you go, okay, but where do I fall in the aggregate, right? Where does my country fall in the aggregate? Who's actually going to benefit? And it's clear that, like, for instance, with NAFTA and the neoliberal policies that were followed for the last, 40 years in the United States, give or take 50 years, the coasts and the large cities benefited very much better very much more than the rural America or industrial America.
Hmm.
And that was a conscious trade-off. No one was confused about this. The people who were promoting this 100% knew this was going to happen. So this isn't like retrospectively going, oh, we had no idea that would be a byproduct. No, it was, predicted. Clearly, this was the implication. Lower your barriers, cheap stuff comes over, show your factories aren't that competitive. We'll get rid of them. That's fine. And we'll make money other ways. And so to a lot of extent that happened, and lots of other good things happened, but yeah, who's paying the cost? And whether, again, is it an ethically sound argument to say, yeah, if a couple of million Mexican farmers have to suffer so that a couple of million Mexican people in major cities can do better, do we take that trade? There was a businessman, and I can't remember who, and he was interviewed about this because he was shutting down his factory in the United States and moving it to China. But he was oddly willing to just do this publicly and be interviewed and didn't care. And they said, but don't you realize that you're laying off, 500 workers here and 1,000 workers there, and it's their families and communities and cities that are going to really suffer, and the tax base is going to go away. And he said, yeah, but for every person I lay off in the United States, I'm hiring 5 people in China, so I don't care. Right?
Yeah.
And you go, well, if you're not a nationalist, which he clearly isn't, then on net you go, that's great. Sure, screw those people in the United States. But if you are a nationalist or a localist or even just concerned with yourself, and again, this is why when you look at things that are based on equations, remember, you're not an equation, you're not a number, you're a human being. And you can say, oh, on average, wages have grown so much, but okay, but where have those wages grown? If I'm a rural farmer, how much have I benefited? Where have my costs increased? What competition have I faced? Or in England, one of the things, they interviewed people leading up to Brexit, and they said, hey, look, my small rural English town that I grew up in, raised in, just changed dramatically in 5 years. Lots of new immigrants from Eastern Europe or from other parts of Europe. Things are happening. The real estate values skyrocketed. Nobody asked me. Nobody came in and asked me, did I want my whole pattern of life to be changed? And now they're asking me if I'm pissed off about it. And you know what I'm saying? Yeah, I'm pissed off about it. Right. And so, these sorts of ethical questions, and also notice that the beneficiaries of the neoliberal order are people like economists and insurance people, and the educated elite have done very much better out of these transformations than blue collar workers in the developed countries, because it's been driven by finance, it's been driven by insurance. One of the deals all these trade deals almost invariably involve is, you have to open up your markets to our insurance company, to our financial investment, to our management teams, to all these things that often are not allowed. And so they go, okay, but you have to open your market up to our rice. And we go, well, it turns out the people sitting at the table go, we don't even know any rice farmers, so sounds good to us. Right. And so, yeah, whose ox is getting gored and why is always a question to ask. And again, remember, when you see economic statistics, be careful. Like, where do you fall in the statistics? How does this work for you and the people that and the kind of life that you're interested in? And that kind of the incentives that are created very variable in the impact. So one other example that we're all been living through is Starbucks has become so massive, and Keurig, that basically they don't totally control world coffee prices. They pretty much control world coffee prices. I mean, they have just massive impact on it, to the point where they've just been bankrupting farmers by being able to drive down the global cost of coffee beans, because they have such a, again, monopolistic position in the market. And when there's only one bidder, you know what they bid? They bid low. And so, but they've been consistently raising prices in the store. And so who gets all of that money? It's the person who's in between. Yeah. And so another example of this, within keeping it, and then of course this drives massive migration from like Guatemala and such to the United States, because these small scale farmers are getting wiped out by Starbucks. And then people in the United States drinking Starbucks complain about the migration of the Guatemalan immigrants, not recognizing that they're drinking them into the country, right? Like this is literally the process. And all of these incentives in globalized markets, of course, have globalized impacts. So if you have localized markets, you don't have global impacts. That's, this is what happens. And so these global knock-on effects, and people go, oh my gosh, all these immigrants coming from Central and South America all of a sudden, why? And it's like, well, one of the reasons, and a major one, is this sort of collapse of the coffee market and the complete dislocation of it. So that, yeah, it's globalized, and so you have global impacts, not unsurprisingly.
Right. And Mary asked a question about the difference between the decrease in poverty that happened so dramatically during the neoliberal period worldwide, but what we hear about in America recently in the last 20 years is a shrinking middle class, and also disparity between the rich and the poor, the 1% and that kind of stuff. So what's the relationship between that, like those two?
Yeah. So here's, I mean, wow, these are different forces. There's no clear necessity that the massive accumulation of wealth that's creating these spectacular wealth gaps, are necessary, but they do seem to be a byproduct. So one way to think about it is, if you create a global company, it's going to be global in scale, and hence who's ever at the pinnacle of that global scaled financial institution is going to be globally wealthy. Right? Again, this is the free market. Hey, let's have a global everything. Well, you create a very tall mountain, at the peak of which you often get these absurdly wealthy individuals and corporate entities. And no one knows how to respond to this. This is a new thing. No one has figured out yet. Because if people say, oh, tax them, like, okay, where? Right? Again, this is one of the, who controls a global entity when you have nation states, right? That's one of these things that's being fought in courts all over the world right now, is to try and figure this out, because nobody knows. The decline in the middle class, this depends on where you measure, right? If you talk about the United States, somewhat. If you talk about globally, you've had a big boom until recently. China is sort of blowing its middle class up as we speak. India seems to be trying to grow its middle class. But globally, probably over the same period, you would see on average an increase in the middle class. In the United States, though, I think it's if you look at the statistics, it's not that terrible. What's been happening, however, I would sort of counter argue, it's not so much the shrinking of the middle class as the increasing difficulty of assuming that the middle class narrative has changed. So it used to be like, okay, what does it mean to be middle class? One, you're going to do better than your parents. Well, the growth in GDP in the United States has decelerated, and increasing amounts of that growth have accumulated to very few people. And so it's like, oh, so the chance that I'm going to do a lot better than the future than my parents did is decreasing, and decreasing quite significantly. Also, the cost of those things associated with being middle class has gone up dramatically, in part because of some of these neoliberal financial reorderings and freeing up sort of investment markets. So if it's to have a house and get a college education, well, those things have gone, I mean, they've inflated so many times more than the inflation rate, and certainly faster than wages have. So it's like middle class income is not shrinking so much. It's going up okay, it's struggling with inflation, But middle class lifestyle is absolutely getting gutted because, healthcare costs, education costs, housing costs, all the things that used to be like, oh, here's the deal. You work a decent job, you can get a decent house, you can have some decent healthcare coverage, and your kids can go to college, all of a sudden is just vanished. And it's vanished for a number of specific reasons. But in the case of housing, it's been the financialization of the housing market. And so they're assets. And so whenever somebody says, oh, your house is an asset, you're like, right. That is what is destroying the affordability of housing, is because it got converted into a house, into an investment vehicle. And these are very different things. But that was a regulatory conversion. This wasn't a natural happening. It was changes in regulation that allowed for, encouraged that transformation to happen. And so, so this neoliberal growth that has achieved a lot of things that are, again, on average good, reduction in poverty over the world, less starvation, less hunger, has also driven a lot of these things that are causing a high level of discontent, particularly in developed countries, which is kind of back to the previous question, is that a price that has to be paid, one, or is this just bad regulation and stupid lobbying, or is it actually justifiable where you can say, yeah, if a bunch of Americans can't afford to buy houses, but we can get 200 million Indians out of dire poverty, we'll take that deal every day, right? This is an ethically defensible economic system.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem I have, to kind of go to the big picture, is that those kinds of conversations rarely, if ever, happen. Like, they're almost unaskable, because political leaders within countries can't really ask those questions, because the answer they have to say is no, what we're doing is absolutely best for our people. I mean, what president's going to say, you know what, we decided to throw 50 million Americans under the bus, but we saved 400 million Indians, right? This is, while ethically defensible, kind of Benthamite, most good for the most number, not a winning campaign strategy, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. And back to Calvinism, and we know what's right, and we got to stick to it. Yeah.
Right. And so what happens is, just thank you for putting that in there and bring it back to the series, is it does tend to then be distributed under the rubric of, this is the right system, this is the best way. And if you question the system, it's not like, oh, this is a problem, blah, blah. It's, then you're denying the power of the United States. You're trying to resist the growth of global. You're trying to impoverish the people, right? This kind of language, comes out. I was looking at the El Salvador. The World Bank did a report on El Salvador, which is struggling in many ways. And they said, oh, but one of the strengths of the El Salvador economy is remittance payments. It's like 30% of their GDP or something. It's some crazy number. And remittance payments are when your citizens go abroad, work usually under, less than ideal circumstances, and send money home to their even poorer relations. Mm-hmm. Ideally, remittance payments would be zero. But to the World Bank, they look at it, neoliberal institution par excellence, they look at that and go, oh, look, you're getting income from this. It's helping your GDP. It's good. Right? The fact that whole cultures, villages, families, economic systems are so disrupted that your people have to go someplace else and work in really generally unpleasant conditions just to survive and send something home so those people at home survive. And that's 30% of your GDP. Yeah, this is not a strength of your economy. It's a sign that your economy is, in very bad shape indeed.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Wes. Those are all the questions that we selected for this week.
Well, great. Thanks, everybody, for the questions. Really appreciate it. Keep them coming in, because they do, I think, hopefully help clarify and get stuff that I miss. And this has been very interesting, because, like I said, since I've done this, I keep the neoliberal one in particular, I keep seeing, because it's under threat right now, it is sort of being questioned, but I keep seeing, articles. I go, oh, there it is again. The inability of either the writers of the articles or the politicians or the economists, they can criticize, they can recognize a problem, but they can't articulate any clear, like, oh, well, just get rid of this assumption about how neoliberalism has to operate, and this isn't a problem, right? Let's just put a regulation in here that stops this bad thing from happening. And if the financial markets don't like it, well, too bad for them. Like, this doesn't, they're like, no, 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 this can't happen. Classically, one time when, I think probably even true today, like the Federal Reserve keeps getting run by people who used to work at Goldman Sachs and other large global investment firms. And people keep saying, well, why is that? And they're like, well, because they're the ones who know how large global investment works. And it's like, yeah, they know how it works for them. Right? Like, are those the people who should be running the show? Like, that's so embedded. Like, all of these assumptions are so embedded that if you look at the banking regulatory agencies and the financial regulatory agencies and in governments, not just the United States, but all over the world, they tend to be made up of bankers and investment brokers and hedge fund people. And this is their background and experience. And they go back and forth. They go back and forth from government into private sector and from private sector back into government, because of course, who else would you want regulating your banks but bankers? Because it would be madness otherwise, right? They might not understand how the neoliberal system works, and then they would do wrong things.
Right.
Yeah. So, all right. Thanks very much, Jeremy. Appreciate it. And we'll have another episode coming up very soon in the cultural history of the United States. Thanks.
Thank you.